Ziprick and I were just discussing how far apart did we actually grow up out there in Manitoba, Saskatchewan. In my own case, I grew up in a farm community about 3 miles west of the border, which they then were coming 12 miles. About 12 miles east of the border. So this was part of a kind of a cluster of German Lutheran. They also had some Polish Lutherans there and English. And at any rate, kind of a cluster of congregations, communities that were known as the Assiniboine Circuit. And I think if you look at the pastors that were produced, especially in the last generation, quite a number of them came out of that circuit. As for example, in Alberta, out of the Stony Plains circuit. So this kind of makes the connection. Although I have to say that I did not meet him until he came to heaven, because he happened to slip down south for a while, and I was kind of in and there up here. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Ziprick to give our lectures, Timothy lectures. And I want to apologize because I think I misrepresented his topic the other day when I in chapel. I think I said what I didn't learn at the seminary, and what his topic is what I wish I had been taught in the seminary. It kind of comes out to the same thing, in a certain sense.
Just a swear one would have been longer.
At any rate, I think there are, as someone who served in the ministry for a number of years myself, I think that when you get into the ministry, you find that there are many things that you either were not taught or you weren't listening when they were being taught, and you wish that you had learned them in order to be able to do your ministry better. So we're looking forward to a rather exciting sharing of Ziprick's walk of ministry and life. And this, of course, being a Timothy lecture, is directed particularly to students, for you to become invigorated and excited, and perhaps learn a few things about what you should be watching for in the course of your seminary training. And if you're not being taught it, maybe you should be asking some questions. So we turn things over to Dr. Ziprick, and we'll let him talk about what he has prepared for us, and we welcome you, and let's give him a clap.
Thank you very much. You didn't tell me it was to be invigorating or exciting. So maybe we should start all over here. I think the circuit that you and I were part of was better known as the Ponderosa Circuit. Is that not true?
It had that name as well, right?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was later on. Yeah, there was the Borchards were there, the father and 3 sons at one time in the same circuit, and it was called the Ponderosa Circuit. And yeah, I at one time had counted up how many clergy came from that circuit, and it was just a staggering number from that small area of people who went into the pastoral ministry. And yeah, the only time, I guess, our ages are significantly different. I'm still young, and you were much older. Therefore, by the time I went through Walter League and McNutt and so forth, you were probably gone already by that time. Correct?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure. When Dr. Trinan asked me about the Timothy lectures, I hesitated, because he said it's to be with people who are to be somebody who's a well-seasoned pastor and share some of their experiences and so forth. And I guess I'm seasoned. I don't know that I'm well-seasoned. If look at that, I've been cooked and I've been roasted and I've been grilled. I know that. And I've had the fork poked in me a few times. I know that. But whether I'm well-seasoned, I'm not sure. He said that I should think about, he said, in light of the experiences I had, I could talk about cross-cultural ministry. Yeah, I've had quite a bit of experience in that. He said, you could do something with relocating a congregation. And I thought, well, yeah, I've had some experience in that. He talked about, going into the inner city, back down into St. Peter's and doing something, talking about that ministry there. And yeah, we could talk about that. But I was trying to think of something that's going to be relevant to you. And so whether what I talk about today is relevant or not, I guess is also going to be up to you. Seminary is a seedbed. And so therefore, hope today that I can plant some seeds. If I don't plant seeds, at least I hope that I muck around in the soil for you and dig around a little bit and maybe disturb the soil. Don't know. That's going to be up to you. And so I came up with the topic, what I wished I had been taught in the seminary, based upon the experiences that I ran into after I left the seminary. And I looked at it and I thought, boy, I should have known that. If I had known that, I could have made better decisions. I could have led better. And so, therefore, that's the way I arrived at this topic for today. And as we begin, I'd like to invite you to join with me in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, your Son is the Lord of the church, the head of the body. We call it the body of Christ. And therefore, as we seek to do your will and your ways and to walk in them, we continually need to be looking to you as the source of all goodness and wisdom and love and guidance and nurturing, so that we would be able to be the body that you have made it through your Son's life, death, and resurrection. That we would be a body that is beautiful, that you would be able to look at us as a bride that is without spot or wrinkle or any blemish, and that we would be within the world a radiant church, a church that is going to be beaming forth the light of your love through Jesus Christ, and by the power of your Spirit that we would be doing that. And therefore, all that we think about this day, all that we discuss, all that I offer up, place it into your hands, so that you might be able to receive all praise and glory and honor, and your kingdom might be done on earth as it is in heaven. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Provided a bit of an outline for you. Dr. Lehman looked at it quickly to see if there were pictures. There are some. I guess I provided to you so that if you nod off during the day, you can follow along, you can pick it up later, and you can say, oh, now we're on page 6 or whatever it is. And or if you get carried away on your laptops on something else, that you can jump back and forth and you can keep track of where we're going. I taught school at one time, and I taught English literature in high school. And there was a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson on Ulysses. And Ulysses has sailed around the world. And he has come back, and his words are, I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever as I move. And so I see myself also as somebody who is a part of all the experiences. I'm a part of all that I have met. I have been shaped in numbers of different ways. I was raised on a farm, mixed farm, western Manitoba. But my dad taught me a number of things from the farming that were very applicable and that certainly have been foundations for me in serving in pastoral ministry. My dad taught me that you need to cultivate things. Means you need to prepare. You need to prepare the soil. And sometimes cultivation and preparation takes more in ministry than I really ever realized it. And after you prepare and you cultivate, the second thing he taught me was that you plant the seed. And as a kid, you'd plant the seed, whether in the garden or a crop, you'd wait, and nothing would be growing, and I'd tend to go over and I'd start digging around. Is there something wrong? Dad says, no, you got to be patient. You got to be patient after you plant, and then you got to trust. Because in farming, you cultivate, you plant, and then you trust that God is going to make it grow and he's going to bring about the increase. And that's really what the pastoral ministry, in my understanding, is all about. And then he taught me that you always need to be ready for the harvest. As soon as you finish planting, you start thinking about getting your harvest machinery all ready for the harvest. You don't wait until the grain is ready that you say, oh, I need to start getting ready. You start getting ready ahead of time. One of the other things he talked me about was, he said, Marv, when you approach the horses, you always talk to them. He said, you never approach the horses from behind without talking to them. And it taught me about communication. That pastoral ministry is all about communication. You don't blindside people. You communicate, and you communicate. My dad taught me that you are never too proud to clean the barns. The barns need to be cleaned. And he taught me that, you need to take the shit out sometimes. You need to clean the barns. You need to get dirty. And so therefore, he taught me that there is nothing in pastoral ministry that I will ever ask anybody to do without my also being willing to get along beside them and to do it. And to be there with them. And then he also taught me that a farmer's work is never done. And that's the way it is in pastoral ministry for me. It's always been that way. One's work is never done. And then after the pastoral ministry, or after the farming, I went into teaching because I wasn't sure I wanted to go into 8 years of education. I thought that was too long. 12 years I already had done. Another 8 years? That just seemed a little bit too much. And so what I did was I went to Teachers College in Manitoba, and I took 1 year of methods courses in teaching, and I started teaching in the Interlake area of Manitoba, Aboriginal reservations. And it was the second year as I was teaching that I came to realize one of your reasons for not thinking about the pastoral ministry was you didn't want to keep on going to school. There's something wrong with this picture, Marv. Here you are. Not only are you ringing the bell, not only the first year I had 8 classes, grades 1 through 9, there were no grade 8s, and I was teaching every subject, and I was ringing the bell, I was preparing the classes, I was grading the papers, I was preparing in the evenings, and what's this about not wanting to go back to school? And so the second year, as I had changed to another reservation where I was teaching high school, I decided it's time to be serious about that, to see whether really I'm interested in the pastoral ministry. But in teaching, God routed me through there for a number of reasons. One, he taught me how to plan. Planning is essential in pastoral ministry. He taught me how to organize. He taught me something about cross-cultural ministry, about meeting people where they're at. He taught me about standing in front of people. I'm an introvert by nature. And so I don't like to get up in front of people. And that has always been a difficulty for me. But he taught me, when you're teaching kids, you got to get up in front of them. You got to talk. And so he taught me something about teaching. He taught me about getting in front of people. And then when I went through the pastoral ministry programs, I became part of what we used to call the system. Dr. Trinan, Dr. Kettner, you know about the system, the synodical system. The system is sort of at your predetermined package. It had already decided where you were going to go in and how you were going to come back out. The system shaped you, it formed you, it molded you, and you came out packaged on the other end, pretty much the same as my other 210 classmates did that I graduated with. We were all pretty much cut out of the same cloth. We're pretty much all part of the same system. And then I went into pastoral ministry. My first experience in pastoral ministry was a dual parish in rural Iowa. I'll talk about that a little bit later. My second one was in Louisiana, And then my third one in Bethel and Edmonton, relocated to Sherwood Park. My vicarage was in Kansas. I did field work just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And yet I don't feel that in the midst of all of that, I was ever really, really ready for pastoral ministry. I don't know how you are looking at the congregations that you're part of right now. On the third one there, I ask some questions. What have been your experiences? How has God been shaping you through your congregational experiences? Because I believe He is. For example, the congregation in which you were confirmed. What was the size of that congregation? Where was it located? You will have some things shaped within you as to your understanding of what churches really are all about. The congregation in which you're doing field work. The congregation, if you've vicared already, the congregation you vicared in will have helped to shape you. And so I would like to talk about congregations, and the part one is simply this. Every congregation is the same except for its differences. My seminary education, when I came out, the picture I had of it was that every congregation is basically the same in how it functions and how it operates, sort of like we were all cut out of the cookie cutter as clergy, so every congregation was sort of like a cookie cutter congregation. Churches were pretty much all the same. That's the way I thought of it. And when calls were extended and received and accepted, it was almost as if you could take the deck and you could shuffle them and you could put one person anywhere and they would just simply almost naturally fit in. So that if you took somebody from rural Manitoba, a dual parish, and you wanted to call them and you put them into a congregation in Calgary in the city, you would expect that they would be able to thrive right away, that they were going to be able to fit in. But I quickly discovered that that's not true. I served the congregations in Iowa, rural Iowa. One congregation was a very small one. It averaged about 30 people on a Sunday morning. The other one averaged about 140 on Sunday morning. And I quickly found out they're not the same. And so I began to do, over the course of time, some research when I got to Louisiana, because I was running into some difficulties. I was asked to be the circuit counselor there. And as circuit counselor, we had 9 congregations in the circuit. There were 2 daughters that were planted while I was circuit counselor. But during the 8.5 years I was circuit counselor, I officiated at 16 installations. I covered and spanned the ministry of 23 clergy. There were 4 divorces during that time. I asked 4 clergy to resign, not by myself, but by the authority of the district president working there. There were 3 that had been divorced beforehand. 1 clergy lasted 26 days in the congregation, and that was his first call. Of the 16 installations that I officiated at, 8 of them were straight from the seminary. And I started asking all kinds of questions. What's wrong? What's going on? And so it led me to start asking questions and looking, and I came across and connected with a fellow named Lyle Schaller. And I was visiting with Lyle Schaller, and I was struggling with some things in the congregation I was serving, St. John Lake Charles. And I talked to him, and he said, answer a few questions for me. He asked me 3 questions. I gave him the answers, and he said, let me tell you about St. John. And I said, when have you visited us? He just seemed to know who we were. And so what I did was I began to talk with him and study some of his stuff. And Schaller's pictures are this. His pictures of congregations. He talks about small congregations as being a cat or a collie. He talks about middle-sized congregations as being like a garden or a house. He talks about large congregations being like a mansion, a ranch, or a nation. And he says that in between the small, the middle, and the large, we see it's a different order of creation. And he says they are all very different. Each is unique in its own characteristics. Each presents unique challenges for leadership and for growth. And ministry radically changes with each major break that you come to. So example for the cat. How many of you own cats? Nobody owns cats. Yeah, you don't own a cat. Yeah, what are the characteristics of a cat?
Aloof.
They're aloof. You can't get real close to them.
Very independent.
Very independent. Anything else? It is said that cats have 9 lives. They're very hardy. They have longevity. And so Lyle Schaller picked this picture, and I think it's a very apt one to describe congregations of the size of about 35% of all Protestant churches in Canada, he says, would be of this nature, would be the size of a cat, about 45 and under in worship. And he said, you know, as you talk about cats, here's some of the things that I put down. They would rub against you, but they're tough to get intimate with. They scratch and claw. Cats really run the place. Cats are temperamental. They're independent. Cats really need minimum care. They're hardy. They can be finicky. And cats don't feel guilty. And so cats are very unique animals, but so are small congregations of 35. And when I went to the congregations in rural Iowa, the cat, and then the other one, the next one after it is the collie, that one was a cat and one was a collie. I tried to treat them both the same, but they didn't want to be treated the same. Cats have little formal structure. If you need ushers, you don't have to have a sign-up list. The first 2 people who come there are going to be the ushers. People in the church will keep on saying, that church is dying. They've been dying for 20 years. They've got 9 lives. There probably were some in our church body, our district, when Dr. Lehman was president of the ABC district, who the district execs maybe said, you know, that church is probably dying. Well, they're still probably dying. They're still living. They're still there. But cats usually are family-centered. They're centered quite often about one family or 2 families, and those families will have a patriarch or a matriarch who is the one who basically is overseer or runs the church. And some of these congregations do better during a pastoral vacancy than when they have a pastor. They're difficult to get to grow because cats don't get along well with dogs. And the next one to grow into would be a collie. In this kind of congregation, I've discovered in the circuit I was in that those congregations that were the size of a cat and that were basically centered around a patriarch or matriarch, they would have a large family gathering, and they would quite often make a decision about something that was going to take place at church, and then they would have a voters' meeting to make it official and to ratify what already had been done. And then the pastor would be only about, at that time, would they find out what the decision was. The pastor's role in this kind of a congregation quite often is simply that of a chaplain. You preach, you have some funerals, you have some weddings. They decide something, then they tell the pastor. Everybody in the community knows about what's going on, and then somebody will say, has anybody called the pastor about this? 1/4 of all Protestant churches in North America are basically 50 average and under. 35% of all Protestant churches in Canada, and numbers of years ago, I looked at the attendance for all Lutheran churches in Lutheran Church Canada, and about 30% of all of them in Lutheran Church Canada at that time fit into this category of a cat. The second one that he talks about is a collie. What do you know about a collie?
Friendly.
Friendly, yes. What else?
Faithful.
Faithful. Playful. Yeah. In a collie congregation, Lyle Schaller says they evaluate you, Marv, by asking 3 questions. The first question he said they will ask you is, does the pastor love us? The second question they ask is, the pastor really love us? And the third question they ask is, does the pastor still love us? You get a good relationship developed with this. And the congregation that I served, the collie, the relationships I had with them were just very different than the ones I had with the cat. At the cat, I could spend as much time there, I could schedule office hours there, and nobody would ever drop in. At the collie, I would schedule office hours, and the people would just drop in to chat. I would schedule office hours at the cat, and somebody from the collie would be driving by and they'd see Marv's car there. They'd stop in to visit with me there. They love to talk. They love to establish good relationships. In the collie, you don't need a network for sharing information. You don't need a newsletter. They would say, what do you need a newsletter for? Everybody knows what's going on. They're all connected, one with the other. The collies, they love to be trained, not cats. You never send a cat to an obedience school. Collies love to be trained. They love to go to workshops. The ones that I saw in Iowa and in Louisiana, you'd put on a workshop and they would have 10, 15 people coming to the workshop. They love to learn. They love to get involved. There are very few inactives in both the cat and the collie. The collie tends to feel jilted when the pastor leaves, especially if you've built the relationships. And the congregation that I was at in Iowa, my three predecessors there, they left when they received their first call. And so when I received my first call, what do you think they were doing? They were already packing my bags, thinking he's gone. And when I declined the fifth one, and when I declined the sixth call, they thought, he really loves us. He's here because he wants to be. And relationships take time in small congregations. Relationships take time to build. I interviewed some people in Louisiana in small congregations. Mr. Green was in a congregation that was a cat size. And I was asking him, because they had a pastoral vacancy, and I was asking them about what kind of pastor they need to get. And Mr. Green, as we were talking, he said something, and I said, how long have you been in this congregation? And he said, 21 years. And I said, so tell me about that. He said, well, I still feel like an outsider. Mr. Delafrosse had been president of that congregation, had been an elder, had been a vice president, and as I was talking with him, he had married into that congregation, and he said, oh, I'm an outsider. And so they're tough to get into those congregations as far as relationships. But once you demonstrate to a collie that you are committed to them, they will really, they just will love you there. A collie is the maximum size for an enabler and an encourager style of ministry. If you are at a cat and you go on holidays, they may not even know that you're gone. If you're a collie and you go on holidays, they welcome you back. They're eager to see you. Just very different attitudes. And so the difficulty with growing each of these is that each of them operates as a single cell. And they like to operate as a single cell. And it's tough to get them to grow because you have to get another cell to grow. And it's tough for bringing outsiders in and to get another cell growing.
Could you unpack the maximum size for an enabler style ministry? What do you mean by that?
We'll talk about an enabler style of ministry coming up in some leadership styles.
Awesome.
Yeah, and we'll take a look at it and see if I'll help you at that point. Good question. Yeah. In Lutheran Church Canada, at that time when I looked through it, 37% of all LCC churches were in the collie size of a congregation. Many denominations will not think about planting a new church, starting a daughter, until they can get 200 people in the first service. Because they know that if you have a smaller amount, and if you only get 25, 30, before long, after a year, year and a half, if you're not beyond that number, you're going to have difficulty getting good growth. Because you start developing structure, you start doing things, you start turning to each other, and you start operating as a single cell. And it's very difficult then to start breaking out of that and to growing beyond it. The next one is a garden. He says this is a different order of creation. In a garden, you need to plant and you need to manage. In a garden, people will ask the question, what is our music going to be for Easter? People in the garden will start asking that right after Christmas, because you've got to start planning ahead of time. In the collie, they will simply say, well, the choir director is getting around to it. In the cat, they will say, we haven't even begun Lent yet. Why would we start worrying about Easter? You can manage a garden, but you can't manage a cat. In a garden, you may have several programs and choices and ministries. In the garden, this, for many clergy, would be the ideal size of a congregation. Because, you know, you can do some special things. You can get in the garden. I was able to visit every home once during the year and be able to make that happen. Anything beyond that, and I tried it, and it just tore me up. I just didn't have the time to do it. A garden is a combination of a cat and a collie. It's big enough for lay leadership, small enough for intimacy. In a garden, you need more care and cultivating and tilling. In a garden, if you're a pastor with an enabler or encourager role, style of ministry, you're not going to grow the garden beyond that. The pastor must be organized in a garden. The pastor needs to be an initiating leader. If you're a pastor who was serving in a cat or a collie, you can develop some pretty bad habits, some sloppy habits, in terms of administration, in terms of keeping structure hours, in terms of doing ministry. And if you don't change those habits when you go to a garden or beyond, you're going to be a disaster to that congregation. If you don't change your leadership style from the style that you used in a garden or in a collie or a cat, chances are a garden will be grown down to the style of your leadership. The typical barriers for growth in a garden are one's self-image. Garden-sized congregations, 20% of all Lutheran Church Canada's congregations are basically garden size. But garden-sized congregations, their self-image is usually saying, we're too poor to do that. We're too small to do that. However, of all Protestant churches in North America, they are in the 75th percentile of congregations. The next one, in terms of the mid-size, is the house. The house is big enough for specialized ministries. Members like this size, clergy don't. I struggled with this. The congregation that I went to in Lake Charles was a garden-sized congregation. We began to do some special ministries. We started growing into the size of a house. And I would pedal as fast as I could. And then I would say, I can't do anymore. And I'd back off. The congregation would grow back down to the size of a garden. Dr. Lehman was president of the district when I received the call from Louisiana to come and when I received the call to come to Bethel in Edmonton. And at that time, as I looked at the statistics of the congregation of Bethel, the numbers on the roll of the congregation, the numbers of people that they had on the rolls anyway, was that they should be a house-sized church. As I looked at the size of their worship community, they were about a garden, maybe a collie. And as I visited with them in January of 1987, in the midst of a brutally cold time from Louisiana, Becky and I flew up here. As we were leaving, she said to me, "What do you think, Marv? Are you going to accept the call?" And I said, no way. Because I didn't want to jump into another situation like I had in Louisiana, where it was going to be a house, should be the style of ministry. But a house is very difficult because you don't have enough people to hire a second full-time staff person. It's too much for one person. And so you extend yourself, and you can't do anymore, and then you got to take a break, and then things start pulling back. And so there are about 7% of Lutheran Church Canada churches in this bracket at that time. The barrier to growth for this type of church is that the staffing issue. Too small for a second full-time person, too big for another one. And so in this size church, house churches, you get a growing number of inactive people. In this one, it's where the congregations quite often will start plateauing. You can have in this size church a lot of programs, teaching, equipping. The pastor must be an initiating leader. In this size church, if you're in a cat-sized church, as I mentioned, you can go on holidays and people may not even know you're gone. The collie church will welcome you back. If you're in a garden-sized church, you come back on time. If you are in a house church, you sometimes arrive a day or two ahead of time because you want to make sure you get your bags unpacked and you catch your breath before you start running in the ministry there. And so those are the basic ones. Then there are things that the other churches that he talks about that are a mansion, that are a ranch, that are a nation. Each one of these are different orders of creation. They operate very differently. They are bigger than 95% of all Protestant churches in North America. In Lutheran Church Canada, when I looked at it, 5% of the churches were a mansion, 0.3 were ranches, and 0.3 were nations. The biggest barrier to growth in these churches is new member assimilation. How do you get people assimilated into the body? How do you get them to grow? In these churches, leadership is essential. Organizations can be very complex. Ministries can be specialized. In these churches, you have multiple staff, and you must plan long range. You must plan ahead of time. Generally, I talk to the pastors in our congregation as we are into the fall of 2012. I would start talking to James and to Matt and to say, make sure you schedule your summer holidays for next year. Mark them out, because if you don't, you'll be getting phone calls for weddings, and before you know it, and it's happened to me numbers of times, I would be boxed in where and this happened to me before I had them on board, I would be boxed in with maybe a week here and then a week there, and didn't have consecutive weeks for holiday time, because you get boxed in with this one and you get boxed in with that. And so you need to be able to plan and have a master calendar and to be able to look at that in terms of longer range kinds of things. So that Lutheran Church Canada, there's the numbers over there. Lyle Schaller's picture. He says a small church, it's not a miniature model of a larger church. Small churches, I believe, are not simply churches that are waiting to grow bigger. The call documents I received on every call I ever received, the congregation certainly would say evangelism was one of their big priorities. When you get there, you find it's not really true. Not really true. They're not simply sitting around saying, we want to grow. They have been sitting in hold and sitting on a plateau for quite some time. But small churches are very wonderful churches. I believe they are giving opportunity for intimacy and for security for people. Small churches are strong because they're generally held together. They're glued together by blood ties, by tradition, by turf. Relationships in these churches can be very warm and intimate. Caring can be very spontaneous. The congregation that I served in Iowa, I've been invited to come back to that collie several times to preach at their anniversaries. And wonderful connections with those people. The other congregation that I was serving, that congregation, we attempted in that dual parish to try to bring both of those. In Iowa, there were something like 40 Lutheran churches within a 10-mile radius of our colleague congregation. just loads of Lutheran churches. And so we had talked about the town of Waverly was growing out to our area, the northeast area. And so we said, why don't we join both churches and relocate into that growing area? Because there was no churches there at that point. The cat-size congregation was closest to there, but they said, no, we're not interested in doing it. The Collie said, we're happy to do it, but we never did. Small churches, the leaders may not be the elected people. Sometimes the leaders are unofficial, the matriarch, a patriarch, somebody else. In small churches, the per capita member attendance is higher than any other congregation. And the same with the per capita giving is quite often financially much higher. In a small church, if a person is absent, they're going to be missed. These small churches, they're very tough. They are strong. Small churches, it takes a long time to be accepted in there. In small churches, time isn't marked by calendars, but by events and by pastors. In small churches, they will sit around and they'll say, we began that when Pastor so-and-so was here. They don't say we began that in 1992. They will talk about the life of the pastors being there. In small churches, we would begin things when everybody was there in terms of meetings. We'd plan a council meeting. The council meeting would generally in summer be set for 8:30 because the farmers would be off the field. Our farmers would be finished milking their cows, and the meeting would be scheduled to meet at 8:30. We would quite often begin at 9:30 because not everybody was there yet. The council meeting would last half an hour, and then somebody would say, let's go to town for pizza and beer. And everybody would pack up and head there. And so they're very unique congregations. I loved it. Had wonderful ministry there. And I was blessed in that I grew up in a rural parish. I grew up on a farm. I was able to understand how relationships were established there. And so I established relationships by picking rocks with the farmers, baling hay with the farmers, riding the corn picker with the farmers, and those kinds of things. And as I did that, the relationships would be built and they would be established. Larger congregations, the third category that Schaller talks about, in those churches, the tension that I've lived with is that your work is never done. And as we talked about it, my son Matt, he was going on, he's taking over, the leadership is being transferred to him. And he is on maternity leave. He's on mat leave right now, and with the twins. But several times along the way, he would say to me, Dad, I feel overwhelmed. Dad, I feel swamped. I said, Matt, you're just going to live with that. Your inbox is going to be full even when the Lord returns. You just live with it. And you have to live with that tension. And in terms of church growth, I believe that growing from a small to a middle to a large church isn't about church growth at all. It's about transformational leadership. It's about the leadership that a pastor has within those places. And I find that in Alberta Church Workers Conferences, those clergy who plan the conferences, if they're from churches that are cats or collies, they will generally send out a message about the Church Workers Conference that about, end of July, somebody will send out a message and say the Church Workers Conference is going to be in September. For us, that's too late. September is already booked, as well as October and November and December. And so generally, if we do not hear way in advance when the Church Workers Conference is going to be, we're calling the district office, saying, when is it going to be? Have you heard? Because you need to plan way ahead of time. In the district and synod, they scheduled this past fall Curiosity as Ministry 2 weeks after the Church Workers Conference. That was a disaster for us. And I asked Don Sheeman, why couldn't you and the synod got together and established one and put it together in some way? When we have Alberta Church Workers Conferences and the program is directed to clergy alone, to me it is saying that they don't understand multiple staff congregations, because we have people who are director of parish services. In large churches, we must be involved in continuing education. I've had to do that all my life, because all my pastoral ministry. Large churches aren't corporations. Corporations are groups that do things. Churches are to be. We are to be the body of Christ. And so we're very different as far as who we are as a people. And so with the last thing important to know, I'll let you take a look at some of that. As you go from the left all the way to the right, they become more impersonal in nature. The pastor assumes greater role in initiating leadership and greater demands on staffing. More important to work at incorporating members. It's easier for people to fall between the cracks and to get more people who are inactive. You need more intentional planning and organizing needed to care for people. They're more expensive to operate. The laity tend to become more passive, and those that are involved can have burnout. You need to be careful on that too. More persistence is needed to enlist servant volunteers. Larger number 11 of small group activities needed. More intense planning and scheduling needed. More difficult to pastor or to be a shepherd to each individual member. And so there are two that are out of place, the pictures. And so we'll skip those and just talk about this. So what does this mean? What does it mean for Lutheran Church Canada? What does it mean for the district? What do you think this means for seminary education? What do you think it means for pastors in Lutheran Church Canada? Does this have any bearing on congregations when they are calling a pastor? Do you have some thoughts, comments, or questions? Yes, sure am. Yeah.
Something that occurred to me, how big was the congregation that you vicared at?
I vicared at a church in Clay Center, Kansas. The congregation membership was probably between 500 and 600 people. They had 2 services on a Sunday morning, and the pastor that was there as my supervisor, he had spent 16 years in England in the mission field there, Pastor Bosch, and he had come to Kansas, and just before I got there, he was in the process of having a nervous breakdown. And after I was there for about 2 months, he said, "Marv, I just can't do it anymore." The doctor told him to take a leave of absence. So as a vicar, I was the pastor there for that year.
I reached for asking the question. You talked about kind of changing from one style of ministry to the other. And at least in our day, almost everybody vicared in one of the larger congregations. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
But then when calls came, they were not directed to larger congregations, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking from the educational point of view, seminary education.
Mm-hmm.
I guess just simply the struggle of how much does to what extent do the vicarage experiences kind of almost put a person at jeopardy when you then accept your first call, or when the first calls are issued.
Yeah.
Because that's the congregation that you think you should be going into, but it isn't.
Yeah, it's a good question. How many of you were raised in a city? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where was your first call?
Alligator and Hyper.
Yeah. Yours?
Trail.
Trail.
British Columbia.
Yeah. So it's a town. Yeah. Those are more villages, aren't they? Yeah. And, in some sense, that's almost a cross-cultural ministry. If you're raised in a city environment and then you go out there to it's so different. Life is very different. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so our experiences, I think, that we have, the experiences I had in Inglis helped to shape who I am. And I went back the last time I was in Inglis, not the last time, I made a trip to Inglis with my son Matt before he ever went into the seminary. And we went there to help my mom. My dad had died, and it was something like 1994. We made the trip there. And as we were leaving there, Matt said to me, because he was thinking about the seminary. He had not decided the seminary at that point, but Matt said to me, Dad, if I went to the seminary and I'd be placed in Inglis, I'd die. And I said, yes, you would. Because we sat in the worship service there, and nothing had changed from when I went through confirmation. We still, on the left side of the church, you had E on the hymnal for the English hymns. On the right side, you had G for German, P for Polish. We sang in tongues in our church. And you were right. I think one time you told me that Inglis was a very unique place because it was only 2 places in Lutheran Church Canada where there are Polish congregations. Yeah. And one was in Inglis and the other one was in Ontario.
In Saskatchewan.
In Saskatchewan, okay.
Yeah, near Melbourne.
And so, things really had not changed very much in all those years. And so I was shaped by my experience in Inglis. I was shaped by my fieldwork church in Alton, Illinois. I was shaped by my vicarage, and the only connection that was the same between my first placement and my experiences was my small town Inglis and being raised on a farm. And that was enough to help me to understand them and to establish the relationships. Without that, I would have probably been lost. And as I looked at my 3 predecessors, they all were raised in large cities. And the first call, and they were gone. And the congregation there was hurt every time. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah. When you talk about your ministry, it really seems that you kind of went through starting with the smaller congregation, and now, of course, you're at Bethel. You're at one of the larger congregations, especially in the area here. So you moved through it from small to large. If you reflect on where you are now, if you had come out of seminary, got into a large congregation, and worked backwards through that, and ended up, at the end of or the later parts of your ministry, and in a small congregation, how would that have changed you? Would you be able to work it backwards?
I probably would have died if I had gone to the large one right away. I just wouldn't have been equipped for leadership at all. Wouldn't have been healthy for the church, wouldn't have been healthy for me.
So if you had gone into, as you said, the seminarians that came out of the first call from that city into the small community, if you had grown up, you think that you would have been in that same boat? I mean, that was...
The culture is so different. The personality is so different. And one of the things I think about with the seminary, and later I will talk about it, but I'm not sure, but I'm wondered many times, would it be better if the calls were given to seminarians on January 1, as opposed to in May when you graduate? Would it be better than to say to Jonathan, your call is to Trail, BC, and we want you to spend your last semester here getting to know and getting to understand what that ministry is going to be like, and you spend your whole semester. thinking about it. And so Jonathan then is able to think about what's the size of the congregation. He's able to do some history on the congregation, on the community. He's able to think about it historically. He's able to think about what it means from me being raised in a large city in Edmonton to going to a small place, and he can start interviewing people, and he can start working on it, and then maybe he can do some exegetical stuff on that place, trying to understand the personality and the culture of it, and he can start putting together a systematic plan for how he might want to approach the place and try to understand how he's going to do it pastorally. And I've wondered, would that be better? It's got its problems. I guess every way has its problems. But I would toss that out as food for thought. I know that change is difficult. But, yeah, good question. I think it's also would be helpful if somebody's going to go into team ministry, or if somebody's going to be going into what we would think of as a typical cross-cultural ministry. Yeah. Joe?
It sounds like, from what I heard, there's kind of a sweet spot around the collie or so, or maybe into the garden, where clergy really thrive, the congregations thrive, there's connections made between people. And so I guess I'm wondering, at a point where you kind of see the congregation size is about to grow beyond that, is that something you would want to push through? Or I'm thinking the church that I was doing some experience with in Winnipeg, they were getting to that same stage. They were growing beyond where they felt they could really minister to everyone. So instead of switching to 2 services, what they did is they split off and created a sister church in a different area of the city, and for them that was the solution they went for. Is that something that you would say, in order to keep the congregation kind of at that size where everyone can thrive, or is it better to push through and grow it to that larger size with, I don't know, what do you think of that?
I don't know if it's better. It's different. The Hutterites split at a certain point. And I think the point is about 150 people. And then they split and they start a new colony. I think there are advantages and there are disadvantages either way. And these days, with the cost of health care and retirement and clergy salaries, a collie is going to have a tough time maintaining a clergy salary. That's something you can really live on. And so there are those kinds of things that present some difficulties. There are always trade-offs. Every time we are doing something and we make a decision, I say, so if that works, what does that mean? If it doesn't work, what does it mean? Because you need to be prepared for either way. There are going to be implications either way. Yeah. I don't know if it's better. Yeah.
It's interesting to look at the congregations like this, but I wonder, how do you then look at individual personalities? Because you're going to have people who are cat people in a collie congregation and collie people in a ranch congregation. And so when you break it down to individuals, when you're looking at them as a group, and sort of putting them looking at these categories.
If you're serving in a larger congregation, you probably have a number of cats, a number of collies, and a couple gardens. Your small groups will be acting almost as a cat. You know, small groups, people will be very intimate, they'll get to know one another, they'll be praying for one another, they'll be supporting one another, and you can't, it's tough to get new people into a small group. A lot of small groups like to stay closed because they want to be intimate. They want to develop those, and so you need to develop another cat, grow another cell. And so in churches, you will have those people. In our congregation, each of the 3 worship services has a very distinct personality. Don't know if that answers.
Yeah, I guess the concern would be that, if you start to look at a congregation, okay, well, there's sort of, as a group, there's sort of a cat where I don't have to have that much personal attention, and they don't want me to be, too close. But if you have that one person in that congregation that wants a phone call, that wants you to, put your hand on their shoulder and ask them how they are today, but you're looking at the congregation as a cat that doesn't want that, you don't want to exclude that one person and not be what they need.
Yeah, have to be sensitive to the people and find out, I guess. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments before we take the break? Break is at 10:30, I think. Was that it?
Yeah.
Cody.
Yeah, 10:30, but it's gonna hurt fits.
Okay.
You mentioned a couple of times, you were saying that if you would have been placed in, say, like a large congregation, in your first call, that you would have struggled, it would have been good for you or for the church. I'm curious, before you got your first call after vicarage, what did you think would be the ideal situation? Like, you're thinking, my first call, were you thinking a small one, a large one, somewhere in between? And how do you sort of think through your own personal skills? And I'm saying this personally, like, what I believe my skills are going to be translating that into some of these characteristics and then thinking, well, would this be good? Would this be good? Even just thinking that way, how did you feel when you were in that position as to where you thought you should go?
That's a long story. I was at seminary in St. Louis, 1970 to 1974. Some pretty turbulent years there. And 1974 was when I was placed. The breakup of the seminary was taking place in January of 1974. I had one time had thought about staying at Concordia St. Louis and doing some advanced degree. But in the fall, heading toward Christmas of 1973, it didn't seem to me like things were going to be together. So Becky and I talked about it and prayed about it, and I said, I'm putting my name up for a call. I had enough credits, I could graduate, I could take a call at the end of the winter quarter, the winter semester there, and that end of that semester was February. And so I placed my name before the faculty for approval to be receiving a call. The faculty met together right after New Year, the whole faculty was together, and I was certified to be placed, I think it was on January 3 or January 4. So everything was fine. The breakup took place after that. And so since I had already been certified, your ordination depends upon not graduation, but certification by the faculty. And so I was certified, and therefore there was one call that was given at the end of February. There was one call that came in. It wasn't at that point that I had many thoughts about where. I was looking for moving on. And so there was one call that came, and there was one call that was issued, and I was placed at that one place. So, what was I looking for? I was looking for a call. If you had asked us earlier in the seminary career training, Becky, my wife, would have said that we'll probably be placed in Canada. When they asked me in December of 1973, my answer to them in our interview was anywhere. I knew that things were not going to be very good after the new year, from as I read the tea leaves. And so wherever was wherever, and it ended up in rural Iowa. I don't know that I had any special saying, I wished I would have been this place or that place, that size. Yeah. Good question, though. Thank you. Anybody else?
Just to answer the question too, I think the tendency in those days was a matter of, like, I go wherever I'm sent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Essentially. So, for example, Dr. Lehman and I both vicared in Ottawa. Same congregation, actually.
Okay.
Survived us both. But we both ended up in Western Canada. So.
Yep. Good. Jonathan.
In terms of placement of candidates out of the seminary, this is kind of spurred by your earlier comment of being placed in a larger congregation and how that would have been a disaster. Is there sort of what you would consider a maximum size of congregation where you think a candidate could thrive?
It seems to me, and I could be wrong, I've run this by some of my classmates. I talked about it extensively with Wayne Jensen and Larry McKay, both of them my classmates. I talked about it with Terry Lutz, who was 1 year ahead of me, who was at Markerville. He's deceased as of 2004. And as we talked about it, it seems to me we were all equipped at the seminary to basically be an enabler kind of pastor. And we'll talk about that some more as to an encourager kind of pastor. I never received a class in being a leader of any kind. There never was one at the seminary. I guess you just assumed that you were going to be one when you got there. And when I got to Iowa, I didn't know what that meant. Not that they were necessarily looking for a leader. The CAT wasn't, for sure. The collie, the congregation, the other one at St. Paul Artesian, they would have followed anywhere after you build a relationship with them. They just loved you, and if you loved them, they will go where you wanted to go. And you can abuse that too, of course. But it seems to me that that's the style that basically, and I don't know, maybe you guys can talk to it a little bit more than I, and may have a different view of it, but as I've talked with some of the guys that I went with, it just seems like that's the style we were. And one of the guys that I was talking with about this not too long ago, as I was trying to think through some of this stuff, I was asking him, and he said, and he ended up saying this. He said, Marv, the style of ministry I was taught in was good for the 1950s. And he said, I have never given a toolbox or tools to really lead a congregation beyond the 1970s. That's sad. And I could say more about us as clergy than about things than seminary training, but I think seminaries, we need to at least plant some seeds. I don't know if we do. Time for a break. Thank you.